All right. So Section 3 here is the Constitutional Convention. So we have Shays Rebellion that kind of starts and sparks this idea that, hey, somebody's got to step up. The federal government has to be able to do something to protect citizens. It can't be left up to the states. They're not doing a good enough job. There has to be some kind of overarching rules. And the Articles of Confederation really had no way to do that. So that uprising in Massachusetts really convinced leaders from around the country to act. And after years of goading by James Madison and other nationalists, you have delegates from 12 of the 13 states that decide they're going to meet at the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. Now, the only state who doesn't show up, and they're kind of like honestly, they're like the black sheep of like everything. They're like the last ones to ratify everything, is Rhode Island. They're like these rebels for sure. And they declined. They actually said, nah, we don't want to send anybody. Which is so weird. But they actually show up, and the delegates really arrive at the convention with instructions from their states to revise the Articles of Confederation, not to create a new constitution. They show up in order to revise it, just to kind of make a few changes. The biggest problem the convention needed to solve was the federal government's inability to actually levy taxes. They couldn't actually charge taxes, and that weakness meant that the burden of paying back debt that they racked up during the Revolutionary War actually fell on the states. And so, because the states find themselves kind of beholden to these lenders who had brought their war bonds up, these lenders who had paid for war bonds and given money to the government, they come back and say, hey, you owe us money. When things that happened in Massachusetts, like the farmers going, hey, be on our side, and the government going, well, we can't. We have to side with the banks because they've kind of got us, in the palm of their hands. That's why that happened. And the federal government can't pay them off, can't pay the debts off because they can't raise money. So these people are like, we really have to do something to fix this. James Madison had no intention of actually revising the Articles of Confederation, though. He intended to produce a very new constitution from scratch, right? In the year before that, he had basically completed 2 extensive research projects. The first one he did was on the history of the government of the United States. The other was on the history of republics around the world. And he used this research for the basis of a proposal that he brought with him to Philadelphia. And it came to be called the Virginia Plan, named after Madison's home state. Now, the Virginia Plan was pretty daring. Classical learning basically said that Republican governments really didn't work unless you had a really small country with a homogeneous people, where all the people were kind of the same. And they kind of had the same ideas and the same desires and the same motivations. That's really the only way a republic had ever worked, right? So you think like the early Roman Republic or small countries like Denmark. But in countries where citizens were too far apart or they had too different of interests, republicanism really wasn't a good way to govern themselves. Again, conventional wisdom said that the United States needed to have a weak central government because, they didn't want tyranny. They had just broken away from the monarchy. So they kind of said, the United States, we kind of have to have a weak central government, or why did we break away from England, right? And so they said states should represent themselves on certain matters that they have in common. Otherwise, power should stay at the state and local level. And Madison's research led him to a different direction. He actually believed that it was possible to create what he called an extended republic that would encompass a diverse number of people and climates and customs. Okay, now, for quiz and test purposes, you need to know what kind of some of the main points here were of the Virginia Plan. Okay, so one of the main points of the Virginia Plan was that it needed to have a strong federal government. Strong federal government is part of it. And in that strong federal government, you're going to have 3 branches, a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. And these 3 branches would have power to act on any issue of national concern. The legislature would have 2 houses in which every state would be represented according to its population and the national legislature would have veto power over state laws. So basically, this is the general idea that James Madison brings in. Other delegates at the convention generally agreed with Madison that the Articles of Confederation had failed, but they certainly did not agree on what type of government should replace them. In particular, they disagreed about the best method of representation in this new Congress, right? Representation was definitely an important issue. It influenced a host of other decisions, including how to decide on the national executive branch should work, what specific powers the federal government should have, and even what to do about the diverse issue of slavery. All of that would come down to how are we represented in Congress? And so there was a lot of debate about how that was going to be worked out. For more than a decade, under the Articles of Confederation, each state had enjoyed a single vote in the Continental Congress. One vote. Every state gets one vote. Now, small states like New Jersey and Delaware, they were like, hey, this is great. We're little tiny states. We don't have big populations. We get the same vote as, say, Virginia, which is a huge state. The Connecticut delegate, Roger Sherman, argued that members of Congress should be appointed by the state legislatures, that the state legislature should pick who goes to Congress. And ordinary voters, he said, lacked the information and were constantly liable to be misled and should have as little to do with national decisions. So basically, this guy says, normal people are stupid. They shouldn't get a vote. Why are we letting normal people vote on the legislature? And he kind of has a point. Large states, however, preferred the Virginia plan. They said that they would give citizens far more power over the legislative branch. It would give these bigger states more power. James Wilson of Pennsylvania argued that since the Virginia plan would vastly increase the powers of the national government, representation should be drawn as directly as possible from the public itself. So if the government's going to have more power, it should represent more people. And the way to represent more people is to base representation off of population size. That makes sense. He said no government could subsist without the confidence of the people. Ultimately, Sherman suggests a compromise, and that compromise is what we end up with, right? Where you have a lower house called the House of Representatives, where the members are assigned according to state population. Then an upper house known as the Senate, where each state would have one vote. Now, later it becomes two votes, but at first it was one vote in the Senate each, okay? This proposal, months of debate go by. It gets adopted kind of slightly altered form, and we call it the Great Compromise. Each state has two senators who can vote independently. In addition to establishing both types of representation, the compromise also counted a slave as 3/5 of a person for representation and tax purposes, which you need to know for quiz and test purposes. How were slaves counted in the Constitution? As 3/5 of a person. Now, the delegates take even longer to decide on the form of the national executive branch. Should executive power be in the hands of a committee or in the hands of a single person? And this was really a big debate. How should that office holder be chosen? So on June 1st, a guy named James Wilson moves that the national executive power reside in a single person. And the fact that this is only about 4 years after the American Revolution is extremely contentious. It really kind of conjures up this images of an elected monarch. And the delegates also worry about how to protect the executive branch from corruption or undue control. And they endlessly debate these questions, and it's not until early September that they decide that a president would be actually elected by a special electoral college. How do you make sure that a president's not corrupt? You don't allow the regular people to elect them, which we still do not. We don't elect the president of the United States. We vote, and our vote tells the Electoral College who we want them to vote for. And then they can vote for whoever they want. They do not have to follow what the people vote. They don't have to. They almost always do because of the way it's set up. But they do not have to. basically, the way the Electoral College works is, and we'll finish this section and I'll tell you about the Electoral College. So in the end, the Constitutional Convention proposed a government, and unlike any other, combining elements copied from the ancient republics, the English political tradition, and making some limited democratic innovations, all while trying to maintain a delicate balance between national and state sovereignty. It was a complicated and very highly controversial scheme, all right?